The gavel hadn't even finished its second knock when Dr. Alina Marsh heard the word that would follow her for the rest of her career: fraudulent. Chairman Walter Pierce said it like he was tasting something bitter, letting it sit in the recording microphone a half-second longer than necessary. The conference room at Ashford Memorial's administrative wing smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet glue, the kind of room built for budget meetings, not verdicts. 12 board members sat behind a long walnut table, folders squared in front of them like place settings at a funeral. Alina sat alone at a smaller table facing them, her hands folded, her white coat draped over the back of her chair, because someone, a clerk, maybe, out of some misplaced kindness, had told her not to wear it in. She hadn't listened. She wore it anyway, and now it hung there behind her like a flag nobody had lowered yet. "Dr. Marsh," Pierce said, "we're here because your credentialing file has a hole in it large enough to drive a truck through, and I intend to find out what's underneath it." Walter Pierce was 61 years old and had chaired the Ashford Memorial Board for 9 of those years, long enough to remember when the hospital nearly went under after a malpractice suit gutted its reserves. He had rebuilt it dollar by dollar, donor dinner by donor dinner, and he had done it by treating risk the way a bomb technician treats a wire, something to be isolated, labeled, and cut before it could reach the rest of the structure. He was not a cruel man by his own accounting. He was a careful one. He had spent the entire previous night going through Alina Marsh's personnel, file line by line, highlighting the gap in yellow, then in orange when the yellow didn't feel urgent enough, until the page looked like a warning label. He had convinced himself, by 2 in the morning, that he was protecting something. That conviction was the only thing keeping his voice steady now. 3 years unaccounted for, Pierce said, tapping the folder. Your file says you completed a general surgery fellowship, and then there's a gap. 3 years. Then you resurface at a VA hospital in San Antonio, and 6 months after that, you're here. Hired as a trauma attending with full surgical privileges. No records of where you were. No employer verification. Just a phone number for something called Joint Personnel Support that nobody on my staff has been able to reach. That's because it's a military liaison line, Alina said. Her voice was even, unhurried. The voice of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic was a currency she couldn't afford to spend. It's classified at the level appropriate to the deployment. I can't unclassify it because a hospital board wants a cleaner spreadsheet. Pierce's jaw tightened. This was the part that irritated him most, not her file, but her calm. He had sat across from surgeons who cried, who begged, who threatened lawyers. He had never sat across from one who simply waited him out like weather. That's convenient, he said. A classified job with no verification at a hospital that just so happens to trust you with a scalpel. Do you understand what that looks like to me, doctor? It looks like a woman who invented 3 years of her life because the truth wasn't impressive enough. A ripple went through the board table. One member, a younger man named Dr. Okafor, who sat on the credentialing subcommittee, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. This was Pierce's hearing. Nobody interrupted Pierce's hearings. Beside him, a woman named Grace Whitfield, the hospital's head of nursing, and the only other person in the room who'd actually worked a floor shift with Alina, kept her eyes on her folder, jaw set, saying nothing because she'd learned months ago that Pierce didn't take kindly to being contradicted mid-argument. I built this hospital's reputation back from nothing, Pierce continued, and I will not have it built back up on a foundation I can't verify. as far as this board is concerned, until you can produce a name, a unit, a discharge paper. Anything. Your privileges are suspended, effective today, and I will be recommending to the State Medical Board that your license be reviewed for fraudulent application. You're suspending a trauma surgeon, Elena said quietly, in a hospital with 4 ICU beds and 1 other attending on call tonight. Then perhaps, Pierce said, you should have thought about that before you decided honesty was optional. I have never been anything but honest with you, Mr. Pierce. I've simply been honest within the limits of what I'm legally allowed to say. There's a difference, and I don't think you want to hear it today. I don't want excuses, Pierce said. I want a name, a unit, a discharge date, something a lawyer can hold in his hand. Otherwise, this board has no choice but to assume the worst, and the worst, Dr. Marsh, is fraud. Grace Whitfield finally spoke, her voice tight. Walter, I've watched this woman run codes that should have gone the other way. Whatever she did for 3 years, it made her better at this job, not worse. Nobody's questioning her hands. Grace, Pierce said, not looking at her. I'm questioning her paperwork. This hospital survives on trust, from insurers, from the state, from the families who walk through that door believing the person cutting into them is exactly who she says she is. I can't run a hospital on faith. I run it on records, and her records have a hole in them that I am obligated, by law and by conscience, to close. The first crack in the morning's certainty came 40 minutes later. During a 10-minute recess, Pierce had called so the board could stretch its legs and, privately, so he could collect himself before the vote. Elena's phone, sitting face down on the small table where she'd left it, began to vibrate against the wood in 3 short, deliberate pulses, a pattern, not a ring. The kind of alert built for people who needed to be reachable through any level of classification, without ever appearing to be. She didn't answer it in the room. She turned it face up, glanced at the screen for exactly 2 seconds, and set it back down, her expression giving away nothing. Pierce noticed. He filed it away as one more item on the list of things that looked bad. The way a man collects small stones to build a case he's already decided to make. The second crack came 7 minutes after the board reconvened, when a clerk leaned through the side door and murmured something into Pierce's ear that made him stop mid-sentence. Security downstairs, the clerk said, was reporting that a black SUV with government plates had cleared the front gate without stopping for a visitor badge, and the driver had asked, by name, for the room where the Marsh hearing was taking place. Pierce waved the interruption off with a flick of his hand, the gesture of a man who had donors show up unannounced often enough that surprise visits no longer registered as anything but paperwork he'd deal with later. He had spent 3 weeks preparing this hearing. He was not going to let an SUV rattle the timeline. As I was saying, Pierce continued, turning back to Elena, in the absence of verifiable documentation, this board's recommendation will be. He didn't finish the sentence. The third crack arrived less than 90 seconds later, and it didn't knock. The conference room door was pushed inward with the flat, unhurried confidence of men who had spent their entire careers in rooms where knocking was optional. 2 men stepped in first, both dressed in plain civilian jackets that did nothing to disguise the stillness underneath them. The particular quiet of people who have spent years standing at attention in places most board members would never be allowed to see. Behind them came a third man, older, silver at the temples, wearing a windbreaker with a unit patch stitched small and unremarkable on the sleeve. The kind of patch that told you everything if you knew what to look for, and nothing at all if you didn't. I apologize for the interruption, the older man said, and his voice carried the particular weight of someone accustomed to rooms falling silent the moment he used it. I'm looking for the hearing regarding Dr. Elena Marsh. Pierce rose halfway out of his chair, more from reflex than welcome. This is a closed disciplinary session. Who exactly are you, and how did you get past my front desk? Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Rourke, the man said. 3rd Special Forces Group. Currently attached to the Army Medical Research and Development Command. These 2 men with me are Staff Sergeant Marcus Diallo and Sergeant First Class Aaron Boone. He didn't offer a hand. He offered instead a long, level look around the room. The folders, the recording microphone, the board members frozen mid-motion, and finally Elena, sitting very still at her small table with her coat still draped behind her. A's for how I got past your desk, Mr. Pierce, I called ahead. Your assistant assumed I was a donor. I let her assume it, because I didn't want to explain over the phone why the Department of Defense had an interest in a credentialing hearing. That is a matter for this board, Pierce said. Recovering his footing, though his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. With respect, Colonel, whatever your business is, it doesn't override a hospital's internal credentialing process. No, Rourke agreed evenly. It doesn't. And I'm not here to override anything. I'm here because word reached my desk 2 days ago that a hospital board was preparing to strip Dr. Marsh's medical license over a 3-year gap in her file, a gap she is legally forbidden to explain to you in any detail. I'd ask you to hold off on a vote for about 90 seconds. Sergeant Boone has something he'd like to say, and I think you should hear it before anyone signs anything. Boone stepped forward. He was younger than Rourke, maybe 35, with a thin white scar tracing down through his left eyebrow, and a way of standing that suggested he was more comfortable on his feet than in the chair nobody had offered him. He didn't look at Pierce. He looked at Elena, and something in his face shifted the moment their eyes met. Recognition, and behind it, something closer to disbelief that he was finally standing in a room where he got to say this out loud. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "You probably don't remember me. Kandahar 2019. Convoy hit an IED outside the wire. I was the one with the femoral bleed. The one nobody thought was going to make it onto the helicopter, let alone off it." Elena's composure, which had held through an hour of accusation without so much as a flicker, finally shifted. Not into panic, but into something quieter, a recognition surfacing slowly, like something rising through very still water. "Corporal Boone," she said, "you made it. I genuinely wasn't sure you would." "Because of you," Boone said. "Because you had your hands inside my leg on a bird that was still taking fire. And you didn't stop, and you didn't let go. And you talked to me the whole time so I wouldn't check out." I've told that story maybe 100 times to 100 different people, and every single one of them thought I was exaggerating the calm in your voice. I wasn't. I was there. Nobody's that steady unless they've done it 1,000 times before. Pierce stood frozen behind the table, the folder still open beneath his hand, watching an entirely different woman assemble herself in front of him out of testimony he had no framework to file away. "Dr. Marsh," Colonel Rourke said, "served as an attached trauma surgeon with a forward surgical team supporting 3rd Group operations for 2 years and 8 months. She is credited across 4 separate after-action reports with stabilizing and evacuating 11 men whose medical files list her only as attending physician. Name redacted. I am not here to embarrass this board, Mr. Pierce. I am here because when word reached me that a hospital was preparing to strip her license over a classification gap she is legally forbidden from explaining, I decided that was worth a 2-hour drive and an unscheduled interruption. If you doubt her competence, Diallo added, quiet but even, his voice the kind that didn't need volume to carry, I'd invite your board to formally request the after-action report from the extraction at Spurwan Gar. She ran a field thoracotomy in the back of a Black Hawk, taking small, arms fire, with a flashlight held in her own teeth, on a patient whose heart had already stopped twice. That patient is a father of 3 now. He lives outside Tucson. He still sends her a card every Christmas, though I doubt she's ever told any of you that. The room had gone very still. Dr. Okafor, who had said nothing all morning, finally spoke, his voice barely above a murmur, but audible in the silence. Chairman Pierce, I think we need to seriously reconsider the timeline here before anyone signs anything at all. Pierce didn't answer right away. He looked down at the folder in front of him. The same folder he had tapped an hour earlier, as though it were evidence of a lie. And for the first time all morning, his hand didn't reach to open it. He looked instead at Alina, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the flat certainty it carried at the start of the hearing. You could have told me something, he said, quieter than he meant it, almost defensive, a man searching for somewhere steady to stand. I told you everything I was legally permitted to tell you, Alina said, not unkindly. You didn't actually want an explanation, Mr. Pierce. You wanted a clean file. Some things don't come clean. They come earned, and they come slow. And sometimes they come with a phone call from a man you've never met walking through your door at exactly the right moment. Pierce sat back down slowly. The room watched him do it, watched the man who had spent 9 years rebuilding a hospital on caution realize, in real time, that his caution had nearly cost that hospital the one surgeon whose file he couldn't fully explain precisely because of what she'd sacrificed to earn it. He closed the folder in front of him. He didn't slam it shut, didn't make a show of the gesture. He simply closed it, the way a man closes something he's suddenly ashamed to have opened in front of witnesses. Dr. Marsh, he said, I owe you an apology. Not the kind that goes into the minutes of this meeting. The kind I say to your face, in front of everyone who just watched me get this wrong. I saw a gap in a record, and rather than sit with the discomfort of not knowing what filled it, I assumed the worst explanation, because it was easier than admitting I didn't have all the information. That was a failure of imagination on my part, and it very nearly cost this hospital its best trauma surgeon over paperwork I had no real right to demand in full. Apology accepted, Alina said. Then, after a pause, more gently, for what it's worth, Mr. Pierce, the caution isn't the problem. It's the same caution that kept this place solvent after the lawsuit, the same caution Grace has been telling you about for years. You just aimed it at the wrong person today, and you aimed it hard. Grace Whitfield, still seated beside him, let out a breath she'd apparently been holding since the recess. Colonel Rourke stepped forward and extended a hand to Pierce, who shook it, visibly unsteady, his grip lacking its usual practiced firmness. She's earned every privilege this hospital can offer her, Rourke said, and a few it probably can't. I'd suggest the paperwork reflect that by end of day. The board voted to restore Alina's privileges, without further recess, 12-0. Pierce's own hand the first to rise. Before they left, Boone lingered by the door for a moment, glancing back at Alina one last time. I named my daughter after you, he said, almost sheepishly, like he hadn't planned on saying it out loud. Not Alina. That felt strange. Somehow like I was overstepping. Her middle name. Marsh. My wife thought I was being sentimental. I told her some debts you just carry forward the best way you can. Elena didn't have an answer ready for that. For the first time all morning, she simply nodded and looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been carrying a great deal of weight alone for a very long time and had just felt a small part of it set down. Elena Marsh still works at Ashford Memorial. 6 months after the hearing, she was named Director of Trauma Services, a role Pierce himself nominated her for, and one she initially tried to turn down before Grace Whitfield told her, flatly, that turning it down would be an insult to everyone who'd fought to keep her there. The classified gap in her file remains exactly that, classified. Though the hospital's legal counsel now keeps a standing request on file with the Department of Defense for the day it's finally cleared for release. Boone visits twice a year, usually around the anniversary of the convoy, and brings his daughter so she can meet, in his words, the reason we exist. Walter Pierce kept the folder from that hearing in his desk drawer, not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder that the steadiest people in any room are often the ones carrying the heaviest things quietly, and that the least he owes them, going forward, is the benefit of the doubt he very nearly failed to give.